Welcome to your channel. Sleep well, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Chapter 1. The Cadaver, Synod, in the winter of 897 AD, beneath the viad ceilings of the ancient Basilica of St. John Lan in Rome, a strange silence hung in the air. The church, accustomed to the chants of liturgy and the shuffle of worshippers, now hosted something else entirely. At the center of the nave stood a papal throne, and seated on that throne, dressed in sacred vestments, was a corpse. The man had been dead for months. This was the Cadaver Siote, a trial unlike any before or since, even in the long and tangled history of the church. To understand how Rome arrived at this macabre spectacle, one must step back into the political turbulence of the late 9th century, a time when the papacy was not only a spiritual office, but a fiercely contested political prize fought over by nobles' factions and foreign powers. In these years, the Carolingian Empire had fractured central authority in the West, was a memory, and Rome, once the seat of emperors, had become a city of shadows and ambition. The papal throne was at the heart of it all. Popes rose and fell with dizzying speed between 872 and 965. Over 24 men would wear the tiara many. For only months, each pontiff owed his election to powerful Roman families or to the favor of kings and emperors. North of the Alps, allegiances shifted constantly. Excommunications and accusations of heresy had become tools in political warfare in this volatile landscape. Pope Formosus emerged. Formosus was born in Aosta around the year 8816, a man of diplomacy and conviction. Before becoming pope, he had served as a missionary to Bulgaria and as bishop of the prominent diocese of Porto. His talent for negotiation drew the attention of powerful rulers, including Charles the Bold and Arulf of Carinthia. But in Rome, his popularity bred suspicion. He was accused of aspiring to the papacy prematurely, of abandoning his bishopric, even of conspiring with the Franks against Rome, though. Excommunicated in 876 by Pope John VII, his sentence was later lifted. In 891, he was elected pope. As pontiff, Phosus continued his close ties with the Carolingian nobility, supporting Arnulf of Carinthia, a German king with ambitions for the imperial crown. This brought him into direct conflict with the powerful Roman family of SPO, whose influence in central Italy was growing. Phosus invited Arnulf to invade Italy and liberate the papacy from the grip of the Spans. Arnulf obliged, but his campaign was cut short by illness. Shortly after, in 896, Phosus died. Death, however, did not end the political struggle. It only shifted it. Pope Stephen Vertri VI succeeded Phosus, and under pressure from the Spolon faction, particularly Lambert of Spal and his mother Agult-Trude, he took a drastic step. Whether out of personal enmity or political necessity, Stephen convened a synod to try his predecessor for crimes against canon law. It was not enough to condemn. For Moses' memory, his body was exhumed from its tomb, dressed in paper robes, and brought to court. In the chill of January, the corpse of Pope Phosus was propped on the papal throne. A deacon was appointed to speak for him, though the proceedings were lesser trial than a ritual. Humiliation charges included violating canon law by serving as bishop of 2 sees simultaneously and ascending to the papacy while still bishop of Porto. These were not new accusations, nor were they unusual in the politics of the age. AG, but the spectacle of the dead being judged by the living shocked even jaded Romans. Stephen V, VI, presiding in full regalia, berated the corpse as if it could answer Witnesses were called. Canon law was invoked. Eventually, the Synod declared Formosus guilty. His papacy was annulled. All his acts and ordinations were declared void. His fingers of benediction were cut off. His body was stripped, dressed in layman's clothes, and buried in a peo's grave. But the desecration did not end. There, days later, the corpse was dug up again and cast into the Tiber. The outrage that followed was swift and visceral. Many Romans, horrified by the sacrilege, began to turn against Stephen. v. 6. The macabre trial had satisfied the political names of the Spans, but it had also violated the sacred dignity of the papacy. In a time when saints were venerated through their remains, the abuse of a pope's corpse struck at something deeper than politics. It seemed to many an act of desecration, a rupture in the divine order. Within months, Stephen was imprisoned. He died in his cell, likely strangled. The church, uneasy with what had transpired, quickly moved to erase the stain. A later synod nullified the Cadaver. CID reinstated Formosa ordinations and condemned Stephen's actions. The body of Formosus, recovered from the river, was reinterred with honor. Still, the damage lingered. The Cadaver Synod exposed the extent to which the papacy had become entangled in secular power struggles. It laid bare the vulnerability of the office to factionalism and revenge, even in an age where political trials and vendetta. Dead Pope were on trial, shocked contemporaries. It unsettled the faithful. It cast a long shadow over the authority of the papal office. In the years that followed, the Church wrestled with the implications. Could the legitimacy of a pope be undone after death? What of the sacraments he performed, the bishops he ordained? Could holy orders be reversed retroactively? The Cadaver Senate raised questions, not just of law, but of theology. Canon lawyers and theologians debated the precedent over time. The Church moved to insulate the papacy from such attacks. Procedures were clarified. The sanctity of burial and the finality of death were more firmly protected. The event came to be viewed as a cautionary tale, a warning against letting politics consume the sacred historians. Looking back, have struggled to make sense of it. Some see the Cadaver Synod as the grotesque culmination of a broken era, a symptom of the papacy's deep entanglement with secular power. Others argue it was the desperate act of a weak pope, manipulated by stronger forces. There are those who focus on its symbolism, the dead judging the living, or the absurdity of power taken to its logical extreme. But perhaps what is most haunting is its quiet theatricality. In that cold basilica, before an audience of clergy and nobility, a corpse was made to stand trial, not for what it had done, but for whom it had angered. And though the sentence was overturned, the image remained an empty throne, a lifeless figure, and a church still finding its way between the demands of heaven and the intrigues of earth. The Cadaver Synod did not destroy the papacy. In time, reforms would come. The Gregorian reforms of the 11th century would reassert clerical independence. The investiture controversy would reshape the Church's relationship with temporal rulers. But in 897, all of that was still far off. For a brief moment, the Church had turned against itself in a spectacle both surreal and solemn. And though centuries have passed, the memory of that winter trial endures a strange echo from a city where the living once judged the dead and where power proved stronger, if only for a moment, than death itself. Chapter 2, The Dancing Goats of C.D. I long ago on the highland slopes of Ethiopia, where ridges roll like waves and green hills ripple beneath a bright sun, a young goat herd named C. I watched over his flock. It was an ordinary day, the sky washed in light, the air dry and golden, when something curious caught his eye. His goats were behaving oddly with restless energy and booted one another in lively bursts. CDI had known these goats since they were kids. He had seen them tired and still after long days grazing, but this was different. They were, he would later say, dancing, the cause of their joy. CDI discovered was a cluster of shrubs bearing small red berries. The goats had eaten the berries, and now they seemed bewitched, intrigued. CI plucked a few for himself. Their taste was sharp, earthy, unfamiliar. When he chewed them, he too felt the shift. Not drunkenness, not dizziness, but something more alert, as though the dusk around him had sharpened the hills, drawn into clearer outline. What CDI had found, or so the legend goes, was the coffee plant. The tale of CDI has been told for centuries past, from voice to voice, like an heirloom. No contemporary records mention him. He may never have lived at all, but the story endures not just because of its charm, but because it captures something essential. The idea that coffee was not simply cultivated but discovered, its power stumbled upon, its magic revealed through observation and curiosity. From the Ethiopian highlands, coffee's journey began. The plant Cafea Arabica thrived in the region's fertile soils and temperate climate. For generations, local peoples harvested the berries not for brewing, but to chew. Sometimes they ground them with fat to make energy-rich snacks. But eventually, the bean inside the fruit would take center stage across the Red Sea. In Yemen, coffee found new ground, both literal and spiritual. By the 15th century, Sufi mystics in Yemen were cultivating and roasting the beans, preparing an early form of the drink we now recognize. For these aesthetics, coffee was more than refreshment. It was a devotional aid in candle-lit gatherings that stretched into the night. They would sip the bitter brew to sustain their wakefulness during prayers and chants, seeking closeness to the divine. The Arabic word kahwa originally referred to wine, but it came to name this dark, energizing drink. Instead, a spiritual replacement. In a world where alcohol was forbidden from the Sufi lodges of Yemen, coffee spread quickly through the Islamic world. By the early 16th century, it had arrived in Cairo, Istanbul, Damascus, and Mecca. Each city embraced it in its own way, and with it came a new kind of social space, the coffee house known in Ottoman lands as Cafe Can. These establishments were unlike anything seen before. They were not taverns, nor were they mosques. They were open to men of many backgrounds, scholars, merchants, poets, artisans. Inside, thick with smoke and the aroma of roasted beans, men gathered to read, listen to music, play chess, discuss philosophy, and recite poetry. Stories passed from table to table. News traveled faster than any courier. In a time when literacy was limited and printing presses were few, the coffee house became an engine of culture, a place where ideas simmered like the pots over the fire. But coffee houses also sparked unease. Authorities in Mecca, for instance, at one point banned coffee, fearing the gatherings might breed dissent or distract the faithful from prayer. In Istanbul, Sultan Mahmud IV issued harsh penalties for public coffee consumption, concerned that the drink encouraged sedition. Yet such bans rarely lasted. The popularity of coffee proved stronger than decree. Time and again, the brew reasserted itself as trade routes linked the Islamic world to Europe. Coffee crossed borders. Venetian merchants encountered it, first bringing small shipments back across the Mediterranean. European travelers to the east wrote of the black drink with fascination and a hint of suspicion. Some called it the wine of Islam, noting its social and spiritual role. But it was in the port city of Venice that coffee began its European chapter. At first, it was met with weariness, dark bitter, and foreign coffee didn't fit neatly into the palate, or habits of European kitchens. Some clergy called it the bitter invention of Satan, but others, including Pope Clement VII, were more open-minded. According to one account, the Pope tasted the drink himself and found it so pleasing that he gave it his blessing, remarking that it would be a shame to let such a delicious beverage remain the exclusive domain of non-Christians, true or not. The story reflects a key moment in coffee's shift from outsider curiosity to cultural staple. By the 17th century, coffee houses were flourishing in cities like London, Paris, Vienna, and Amsterdam in England. They were often called penny universities because, for the price of a cup, one could sit for hours engaged in conversation or listening to debate. These were not idle gatherings inside coffee houses. Merchants discussed contracts, scientists shared discoveries, writers sharpened their ideas, politicians plotted, and pamphleteers scribbled. Isaac Newton and Edmund High met in London's coffee houses. So did early economists and future revolutionaries. Unlike taverns, which dulled the senses, coffee houses stimulated thought. The atmosphere was sober with its power, but awake and energize became a symbol of clarity and reason. It suited the age of enlightenment, when Europe was beginning to question old certainties and explore new frontiers in science, philosophy, and governance. Yet even in Europe, the coffee house was not free from controversy. In 1674, an anonymous author, likely a woman frustrated by her husband's frequent absences, published the Women's Petition against coffee, claiming the drink made men impotent, and dull coffee houses, she argued, were a threat to domestic life. The response came swiftly. The men's answer to the women's petition, which defended coffee as a source of vigor and intellect. The debate, though tongue-in-cheek, reflected deeper anxieties about changing social spaces and habits. As the 18th century unfolded, coffee embedded itself into European daily life. It moved from public houses to private homes. Special porcelain cups were designed to hold it. Silver pots were crafted to serve it. Coffee became not just a drink, but a ritual. Morning routines were reshaped around it. Guests were welcomed with it. Deals were sealed over it. And still beneath all the refinement and routine, the legend of CD, I lingered. Painters and poets returned to it. The image of the goat herder and his dancing flock captured a kind of primal innocence, a moment before civilization, before commerce, before ritual. It was a reminder that coffee began not in courts or cafes, but on a quiet hillside, with animals leaping for joy and a shepherd watching. In wonder, historians today debate the details. Was it truly CDI who discovered coffee? Was it Ethiopia or Yemen that first brewed it? These questions may never have firm answers, but the legend serves a purpose. Beyond fact, it binds coffee to its origins in nature, to a sense of mystery and chance across centuries. Coffee has been many things: a tool for devotion, a cause for censorship, a stimulant for thinkers, a target of satire, a companion to the everyday. It has traveled continents, crossed oceans, survived bans and debates, and always it has carried with it an aura of something more than a drink, something close to ritual, something that wakes more than the body. So, when you sip your next cup, think of CDI, picture the hillside, the rustling leaves, the red berries gleaming in the sun. Picture the goats dancing and a shepherd's quiet awe. From that hillside became a brew that would circle the world, fueling minds, shaping cultures, and leaving in every corner it touched the faint, rich scent of possibility. Chapter 3. The Great Molasses Flood of 1919. On a crisp winter day in Boston, January 15th, 1919, the city stirred as usual. The North End, a neighborhood built on layers of history and immigrant labor, bustled with the sounds of horses, hooves, streetcars clanging and children playing. The harbor air was cold sharp with salt and soot, but above all, sweetened faintly by something familiar. Molasses. It was a smell locals had grown used to, coming from the massive storage tank that loomed over Commercial Street. The tank was a giant 50 feet tall and 90 feet in diameter, holding over 2 million gallons of dark, sticky syrup. It belonged to the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, which used molasses to produce ethanol for munitions and industrial alcohol. The tank had been there since 1915, erected quickly and cheaply to meet the demands of war. It stood beside a small rail yard and near home shops and a fire station, despite its size and proximity to daily life. Few thought much of it until just after noon. When the air cracked, it began with a low groan, like the sound of something old and strain giving way. Then came the roar, metal, tearing bolts snapping. The tank burst apart with a thunderous bang, sending a wave of molasses racing outward at an estimated 35 miles per hour. Witnesses described it as a brown wall as tall as a man surging through the streets. It smashed buildings, splintered wood, twisted steel. The elevated train tracks shuddered and buckled. Horses were swept away, their cries muffled beneath the thick flowing mass. People were thrown like dolls. The wave caught a firehouse, squarely crushing the lower floors. The firefighters inside had no warning. In the street, a young boy named Antonio D'Estasio was playing with his sister. He survived, pulled from the syrup hours later. She did not, and all the 21 people died, and over 150 were injured. The molasses knee, in places, slowed rescue efforts. It clung to skin clothes, machinery, emergency workers, some wading through it, some crawling, fought to free the trapped. For days, bodies were pulled from the wreckage. The cleanup took weeks, the memory much longer. How could something so strange, so seemingly absurd, become so deadly? The answer lay in the tank itself. It had been built in haste by a man named A.R. Gell, not an engineer, but a treasurer for the company, pressured to meet production schedules and avoid delays. He skipped critical safety steps. The tank was never properly tested. Leaks appeared almost immediately after its construction, where it seeped. Locals joked about the growing noises it made when full workers painted it brown to mask the stains. But the floors were more than cosmetic. Rivets were too few and poorly placed. The steel used in the tank was brittle with too little manganese to withstand winter stress temperature. Had a roll too in the days before the rupture. A sudden warm spell followed a bitter freeze. The molasses, denser in cold, became more fluid as it warmed, expanding and increasing its internal pressure. Some speculate that fermentation may have created gas, adding to the strain. Regardless, the tank could not hold when it failed. The collapse was immediate and complete. Public outrage followed. Swiftly, a tide of lawsuits was filed, led by families of the victims and the city of Boston. It became one of the longest and most complex legal battles in Massachusetts history. Lasting over 5 years, hundreds testified. Engineers, workers, and eyewitnesses gave detailed accounts. Experts reconstructed the tank's design and flaws. The court concluded that the company had been negligent, that it had failed to ensure safety, ignored warning signs, and placed cost above human life. United States Industrial Alcohol was found liable and ordered to pay damages totaling over $600,000, equivalent to several million. Today, the judgment did more than compensate victims. It set a precedent in the years that followed. Building codes were strengthened and inspections became mandatory. Engineers were now required to sign off on large structures. The idea that a company could be held accountable, able for preventable disaster, gained legal ground for the people of Boston. However, the wounds were not only legal or structural, they were personal. The North End, a working-class neighborhood of mostly Italian immigrants, bore the brunt of the flood. Lives, lost homes, destroyed livelihoods, upended. The smell of molasses lingered for months. Some claimed they could still smell it decades later. On hot summer days, it became a story told to children, passed down in families and communities. For some, it was a dark joke. The Great Molasses Flood, almost too surreal to be true for others. It was a symbol of how little power they had in the face of industrial carelessness. In time, it became both folklore and fact, absurdity and tragedy. Today, a small plaque near the site marks the disaster. Tour guides mention it. Historians reflect on it. Engineers study it. The Molasses Flood remains one of the most peculiar disasters in American history. But behind its novelty lies a deeper lesson. It reminds us of the consequences of haste, of cutting corners, of ignoring what we know to be unsafe. It reveals how ambition, when unchecked by responsibility, can lead to ruin, and it shows how cities, for all their might, remain vulnerable to weather, to material failure, to human error. Could it happen again? Not in the same way, perhaps, but the conditions rushed, decisions ignored, warnings, underestimated risks are not unique to 1990. They echo through time. The Great Molasses Flood is remembered for its strangeness, but its truth lies in its humanity, in the firefighter pinned beneath beams refusing to leave until his crew was rescued, in the nurses who worked in shifts, washing molasses from the wounds of survivors, in the families who rebuilt, who stayed in the end. It is not just a story about molasses. It is a story about people, about a city that faced the unthinkable, and about what happens when the things we build collapse not from nature but from within. Chapter 4. The Republic of Cospaia, a town that accidentally became a country in the soft hills of northern Umbria, where the Apennines ease into farmland and the scent of olive groves mingles with wood smoke. There once stood a republic so small, so unlikely, and so serene that its existence feels almost like a dream. It was called Cospaia, and for nearly 4 centuries it lived apart from the world around it, not by force or ambition, but by accident. The story begins in 1441, in a time when Italy was not yet a nation, but a patchwork of duchies, city-states, kingdoms, and ecclesiastical territories. Florence, wealthy and rising, was entangled in both art and war, expanding its reach. Southward, the papal states, under the temporal rule of the Pope, sought to guard their lands, and influence between them lay a tangled borderland, wooded, rural, and easily overlooked. That year, the Republic of Florence purchased the town of Socro from Pope Eugene IV. It was a minor transaction. In the larger scheme of Italian politics, a treaty was drawn, lines were drawn, but maps in those days were not precise. Surveyors, using landmarks rather than coordinates, made a small error. A narrow strip of land just over a kilometer wide and a few hundred meters across was left unclaimed, neither under Florence nor under the Papal States. in this forgotten crease between powers, sat a village Cospaia. The people there, mostly farmers and tradesmen, were no strangers to uncertainty, but when they realized, they made an extraordinary decision. They chose to remain that way. No lords came to collect taxes. No bishop issued laws. No Florentine official claimed jurisdiction. Cospaia simply continued. The villagers declared their independence with a simple phrase, perpetua et firma libertas, perpetual and firm liberty. No grand proclamations, no wars of succession, just a community left to its own devices. And so began one of the quietest experiments in freedom history has ever known. There was no formal government, no king, no council, no codified law. Disputes were settled by custom and conversation. Elders carried respect, but not authority. A group of heads of households would gather when decisions needed to be made, but there were no bureaucrats, no courts, no armies. The people of Cospaia lived as neighbors, not subjects. What made this tiny republic thrive wasn't just its independence, but its adaptability. In the early 1600s, a new crop arrived in Europe: tobacco. It came from the Americas, an exotic plant whose smoke fascinated and divided the continent. The Papal States declared it sinful. Florence taxed it heavily, but Caia beholden to. Neither embraced it. Farmers began to cultivate tobacco in the rich valley soil. Soon Caia became a small yet active hub for tobacco. Growing and trade, smugglers and merchants took notice. Traders would come from surrounding lands to buy tobacco, free of duty. Some called Caia a haven, others whispered of it as a rogue state. But to the villagers it was simply life as usual. Tobacco brought prosperity. It paid for better tools, stronger homes, perhaps, a little indulgence here and there, yet the village never grew. Beyond a few hundred people, there was no appetite for conquest, no drive to expand. The border remained unmarked, but understood a space where the world slipped by, without interference. KP's isolation was both its shield and its signature. It sat quietly, a speck on the map of Europe, witnessing centuries of turmoil. Without being drawn in, wars came and went. Napoleon rose, and fell Italy itself, slowly formed from the wearing patchwork. But Cospaia stayed there, where challenges, of course, the outside world occasionally took it. Interest, Rome questioned its status. Florence grumbled about lost taxes. But by the time anyone tried to assert control, Cospaia had become an oddity more amusing than threatening. Its very absurdity protected it, a village without rulers, no armies, no taxes. Better to leave it be. The end came, not with a bang, but a handshake, in 1826, after nearly 400 years of self-rule. The Republic quietly agreed to dissolve the Papal States and the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. Split the territory. Cospaia residents were given cigars and papal medals as tokens of appreciation. Some accounts say they celebrated, others say they wept, perhaps both. But even in its absorption, Caia retained something of its spirit. The tobacco fields remained. The memory of freedom lingered for generations afterward. People spoke of the Republic not with sadness, but with fondness, a time when they lived without rule. And it worked today. The village still exists, tucked into the green hills, unmarked by grandeur. A modest plaque stands to commemorate its peculiar history. The church remains, a few stone houses, the fields roll on, and if you ask some, elders will still speak of the time when Cospaia was a country, and no one quite noticed. Historians have puzzled over it. How did it survive so long? Why did it not fall into chaos? The answer may lie not in systems or ideologies, but in the people. They were not revolutionaries or philosophers. They were farmers, weavers, traders, people who valued peace, who understood land and season better than politics. Their freedom was not abstract. It was lived in the harvest, the market, the quiet evening walk. Cospaia reminds us that sovereignty need not roar. It can whisper. It can grow in the unnoticed places. It can last, not through might, but through a shared understanding of enough. It poses quiet questions. What does a state require? Who decides where power begins and ends? And what if the answer sometimes is no one in the long sweep of European history filled with empires and upheavals? Cospaia is a pause, a breath, a reminder that borders can falter, and from that faltering something tender and enduring can emerge. So, if ever you find yourself in northern Umbria, walk a little off the road, follow the winding paths through olive groves and low stone walls. You might pass a worn marker, a shaded grove, and there in the hush of the hills, you might hear the echo of a republic that wasn't meant to be, but was. Chapter 5. The time Napoleon was attacked by bunnies in the summer of 1707. Napoleon Bonaparte stood near the height of his power. The Treaty of Tilsit had just been signed, bringing a fragile peace between France and Russia. The Austrians had been pushed back. Prussia was humbled. Much of continental Europe had, for the time being, bent to his will. He was the master of armies, is the architect of empires. And in a quiet interlude in the countryside, with a different sort of plan, a rabbit hunt. It was meant to be a celebration, a light-hearted gesture of victory and camaraderie. Far from the battlefields, the idea had come from his chief of staff, Alexandre Berthier. Ever eager to please the Emperor MP, he arranged a sporting event for Napoleon and his marshals, complete with fine food, elegant surroundings, and a spectacle of tradition. They would stage a grand rabbit hunt, as noblemen had done for centuries. Preparations were meticulous. A grassy field was selected, likely near one of the imperial estates. The weather was fair. The wine chilled. Napoleon, not known for Ides, welcomed the break. His entourage, still clothed in the sharp edges of military formality, allowed themselves a breath of ease. It was, for a moment, a different kind of gathering, one of smiles and sabers sheathed to ensure a successful hunt. Berthier and his organizers arranged for rabbits to be collected in advance. Accounts vary, but the number was likely in the hundreds perhaps as many as 3,000. According to some tellings, the rabbits were to be released all at once, their panicked sprints providing a lively challenge for the marksman. But something, somewhere in the planning, went quietly wrong. The day arrived. Napoleon and his generals stood ready. The cages were opened, but instead of scattering, the rabbits began to hop toward them. At first, it may have seemed charming, a few curious bunnies, unbothered by grandeur edging close, but soon the charm turned to confusion. The animals kept coming, dozens, then hundreds, bounding, not away, but towards the most powerful man in Europe and his circle of command. They moved with surprising purpose, ears twitching, noses wiggling, feet thumping across the grass. And then, suddenly, the moment turned absurd. The rabbits swarmed. They leapt at boots, clambered up coats, bounced under horses. Napoleon tried to shoo them away with his riding crop. A few guards attempted to wave them off. But the rabbits were relentless, nibbling at uniforms, tugging at trousers. It was not an attack in any violent sense. There were no teeth, bead, no shrieks of alarm. But there was chaos, and it grew quickly. The emperor, bemused, at first began to back away. His staff followed suit. The field, meant for sport and laughter, became a comic scene of men in medals and epaulets retreating from an advancing tide of fur. Eventually, Napoleon fled to his carriage, brushing rabbits from his lapels. The driver snapped the reins, and the hunt came to a most undignified end. The cause of the rabbit rebellion has long been a subject of speculation. The most likely explanation is that the animals were not wild, but domesticated, farm-raised creatures accustomed to humans and expecting food rather than flight. When the cages opened, they saw not predators, but providers. The emperor, in his finery, might have resembled a particularly generous farmer, and so hungry and unafraid, they went to him. No injuries were reported, no punishments were dealt. But the tale lingered. Those present could not help but retell it first with disbelief, then with laughter. It was a rare moment of levity in a career defined by strategy and steel. Even Napoleon, it is said, took the joke in stride, though. One imagines his pride may have smarted more than his boots over time. The story became part of the Napoleon mythos, tucked between grander tales of battles and diplomacy. It was not recorded in official dispatches nor commemorated in marble, but it found its way into letters, memoirs, and later books. Historians picked it up as a curious footnote, and listeners centuries on still smile at the image, the conqueror of Europe harried by rabbits in its way. The incident serves as a gentle reminder of perspective, that even in the grand arcs of history, there are stumbles, that nature in its innocence can humble power, and that not every challenge arrives with banners and drums. Some come quietly, with soft feet and twitching whiskers. For Napoleon, the moment passed. There were more battles to fight, more borders to redraw. The empire would rise higher, then begin its slow, fateful fall. But that one summer day remained a memory tucked behind the medals, a field, a crowd of generals, and a sea of rabbits who simply wouldn't run it, is perhaps the kind of story best told in the soft evening hours when the world has quieted and history feels more human, when we can picture the field, feel the warmth of the sun, and imagine even the great being taken by surprise. And in that image, there is a kind of comfort that life, no matter how grand, is never without its odd turns, and sometimes, just sometimes, those turns involve bunnies. Chapter 6, The Phantom Time Hypothesis. Time as we know it is something we rarely question. It is measured in ticking seconds, numbered years, centuries, that stack neatly atop one another like stones in a tower. We are told that Julius Caesar lived over 2,000 years ago, that the ages stretched from the fall of Rome to the dawn of the Renaissance, the 9th century, and that Charlemagne. These are given firm pieces of history we learn early and rarely doubt. But in the 1990s, a German publisher and amateur historian named Herbert Eilig proposed a different idea, one that would upend this tower of time and pull out nearly 3 centuries from its foundation. He called it the Phantom Time Hypothesis. According to Ilk, we are not living in the early 2000s, but in the 1700s. And the reason we believe otherwise is because almost 300 years of history, specifically from 614 to 911, had never actually happened. They were, he argued, fabricated IGs. Theory sounds at first like something from a cleverly written novel, but he presented it with sincerity and detail. The story, as he laid it out, begins with the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III and Pope Sylvester II. Around the year 1000, Eilig claimed these two powerful men conspired to reshape the calendar and elevate their own time in history. Their goal, he said, was to place themselves at the grand and symbolic milestone of the first millennium, the year 1000. And to do so, They needed to manufacture a few centuries according to the hypothesis. They inserted the years between 614 and 911 into the historical record. This meant inventing rulers' events, and even an entire epoch. Among the fabricated figures, Illig placed one of the most iconic of all medieval kings, Charlemagne, the great unifier of Europe, the man whose empire would become the foundation of the Holy Roman Empire, the crowned emperor of Christmas Day in the year 800. Illig insisted Charlemagne was not a historical figure at all, but a mythicon instructed to fill in the invented timeline. To support his claim, Illig pointed to a variety of anomalies. He argued that there was a suspicious lack of reliable historical documentation from the early Middle Ages, that architectural developments appeared to stall during those centuries, that the Julian calendar, when corrected to the Gregorian in the 16th century, required fewer leap year adjustments than it should have had nearly 300 additional years actually passed. He also cited misalignments in astronomical observations, claiming they did not match what we would expect if the traditional chronology were correct. In IG's telling, the centuries label, the Dark Ages were not poorly recorded. They were simply never lived. Other fringe historians picked up the idea. Some reinterpreted it through different lenses, layering it with ideas about mass manipulation, lost civilizations, or ancient technologies hidden in time. The phantom time hypothesis became a kind of thought experiment, a challenge to the very idea that history is fixed. But for all its intrigue, the theory faced strong and consistent opposition. Mainstream historians quickly raise red flags. The early Middle Ages may have fewer surviving records than other periods, but they are not empty. Thousands of documents exist, written in Latin and Greek, preserved in monasteries and libraries, chronicles, letters, legal codes and charters, some mundane, some profound, create a tangled but traceable thread through the centuries. Illig sought to erase archaeology too, stands in the way of the theory sites across Europe, from Saxon villages in England to Byzantine churches in Greece, contain layers of human activity that date precisely to the disputed period, coins bearing the names of kings, pottery styles that evolved gradually, even graves with datable remains. All of it points to the existence of real people living real lives between 614 and 911. Perhaps most damning to the hypothesis is the realm of astronomy. Historical records of eclipses, planetary conjunctions, and comets were made in various parts of the world, not just Europe, but also China and the Islamic world. Many of these events are precisely datable through modern science. The consistency between these records and our current calendar supports the traditional chronology. To erase 297 years would require a massive coordinated forgery, not just across Europe but globally. Still, the theory lingered in certain corners of historical discourse, not because it was widely accepted, but because it scratched a particular intellectual itch. It made people reconsider the foundation of what we believe to be true. And in that sense, it belongs to a long tradition of alternative histories, stories that run against the grain of consensus and ask, but what if? Why do such theories persist? Often, they emerge from the edges of skepticism, a desire to question authority, a frustration with ambiguity. History, after all, is full of uncertainty, lost records, biased, chronicles myths that become accepted fact. In that uncertainty space opens for speculation. For some, it becomes a game of pattern recognition. For others, a form of rebellion. For still others, simply a fascination with the strange, the phantom time hypothesis is not without its imaginative appeal. There is something quietly thrilling in the idea that entire centuries might be phantoms, that our modern moment might not be as modern as we think. It invites us to reconsider the past, but as a story, one that has been written, revised, and sometimes rewritten, yet the weight of evidence favors continuity. The slow march of agricultural tools, improving the steady shift of language from Latin to the vernacular tongues, the emergence of styles in art and architecture from Romanesque to Gothic. These things rarely leap forward all at once. They creep shaped by human hands and habits season by season. And so the world most scholars see is one in which time did not val Spanish, but trudged on through monasteries and markets, famines and festivals, where Charlemagne was not a fabrication, but a ruler who, like many before and after, tried to mold the world to his vision, where history is not perfect, but not falsified on the scale the phantom time hypothesis would require. Still, the story remains a curious mirror. It reminds us how much we rely on the past to tell us who we are, how quickly a strange idea can unsettle what we thought was solid, and how the passage of time itself, so central to our understanding, is both deeply measured and quietly mysterious. Time is not only a tool of clocks and calendars, but a story we tell together, a collective agreement built from fragments, some written, some carved, some remembered. And while most of that story holds, we find room now and then to ask strange questions, to imagine, to doubt. And in doing so, we reaffirm what we do know by brushing against what we do not. So whether or not 3 centuries were ever truly lost, the idea that they could be asks us to look more closely at history, not with suspicion, but with wonder, to trace the lines between myth and memory, and to remember that even in the most settled stories, there are always shadows, and perhaps that's what makes history enduring. Not that it is flawless or unchanging, but that it remains open to questions, even the strange ones, even the impossible ones. In the end, we live in the story we agree upon, and that story, for all its imperfections, continues to unfold. 1 year, 1 layer, 1 question at a time. Chapter 7, The Island of Utopia. When an Englishman imagined a perfect society in the early years of the 16th century, as ships began to chart the outer edges of the known world, and Rena thinkers peered inward into the structures of society and the soul, a quiet man in England was writing something peculiar. He was a lawyer, a scholar, and a rising figure at the royal court. His name was Thomas More, and in 1516 he published a small, strange book with a Greek title and a Latin voice, Utopia. Thomas More lived at a crossroads of history. Europe was changing rapidly. The printing press had loosened the grip of silence, allowing ideas to travel farther and faster than ever before. Martin Luther was hammering his thesis in Wittenberg. Columbus had only recently returned from the New World. The medieval order, with its feudal duties and divine hierarchies, was starting to fray. And in England, More served as a trusted counselor to Henry VII, a role that would one day cost him dearly. But before all that, before the oaths, the trials, and the scaffold, he sat down to imagine a different world. Utopia is at first glance a travel tale. It begins with a fictional narrator, also named Thomas More, engaging in conversation with a well-traveled man called Raphael. Hit, Raphael claims to have said, filled with a meo voce, and stumbled upon a remarkable island unknown to Europe, where society has been organized with wisdom and care. Utopia, The island is orderly but not dull. The people live in harmony, not because they are forced to, but because the system they live under rewards cooperation over greed property. As communal gold is used for chamber pots, education is universal. Every citizen works, but not to excess. The workday is 6 hours long, leaving time for leisure study and community life. The utopians believe that a fulfilled mind and balanced body are as important as any material. Wealth religion is tolerated in all its forms, as long as it doesn't lead to cruelty or arrogance. Leaders are chosen for their merit, not their bloodline. Laws are few, simple, and accessible to all, and no lawyer is needed because everyone is expected to understand the rules of society. This imaginary land, drawn in elegant Latin prose, is both alien and familiar. Some of its features seem radical. Even today, others reflect Moe's deep immersion in classical thought, echoes of Plato, Cicero, and Augustine Wind. Through the dialogue, but beneath the surface of this imagined island, lies a subtle tension. Moe called his creation Utopia, a name derived from Greek that means both no place and, with a small twist, good place. The ambiguity is deliberate. It is never quite clear whether Moore is endorsing the utopian model or gently mocking it. Raphael, the narrator's companion, is passionate but inflexible, full of ideals, but lacking the political subtlety. Moore himself was known for the fictional. Moe listens, nods, asks questions, and in the end, politely, withholds agreement. This ambiguity has puzzled readers for centuries. A blueprint for reform or a clever satire of unreachable ideals? The answer, perhaps, is both. Moore lived in a world where he had to speak carefully. His positions at court required discretion. His faith required conviction. Utopia allowed him to explore the failures of his own society, poverty, corruption, inequality, without pointing fingers too directly in the centuries that followed. Utopia traveled further than Raphael ever could. Enlightenment. Philosophers cited it when imagining rational states. Early socialists found inspiration in its vision of shared labor, and Good's religious reformers borrowed its ideals of simplicity and communal life. And long after Moore was gone, communities across Europe and the Americas would attempt to build their own versions of utopia in fields, forests, and faraway frontiers. Some of these experiments were small monastic orders or intentional agricultural communes. Others were bold and expansive, like the Shakers, the Owenites, or the early Zionist Kutum. Most faced struggles, some fell apart, but all carried a spark that can be traced back to Moore's imagined island. The word utopia itself entered the language as Moore's enduring G. Over time, it came to mean an ideal society, often unrealizable, sometimes dangerous in the 20th century. As ideological regimes rose and fell, utopia became a double-edged word. It stood for both hope and hubris, dreams and dogma. But in Moore's original conception, the idea was gentler, quieter. It was a mirror and a question. Why do we tolerate poverty in a world of plenty? Why do we cling to punishments when rehabilitation is possible? Why do we compete when cooperation brings greater peace? These were not abstract puzzles for Moore. They were the daily dilemmas of a society in flux. The brilliance of utopia lies not just in its details, the shared meals, the rotating housing, the rejection of ornamental wealth, but in its posture. It does not shout, it invites, it does not command. It suggests, and through its fictional frame, it frees the reader to imagine a better world without demanding belief in its feasibility. Thomas Moore would later be canonized by the Catholic Church, martyred for refusing to accept Henry VIII's break from Rome. His silence, his final act of conscience, became the stuff of plays and legend. But Utopia, written in a time of relative quiet, reveals a different kind of courage, the courage to ask gently but insistently what a good society might look like, and whether we could ever build it even today, in a world vastly changed. The questions Utopia raises remain close to us in conversation about universal income, restorative justice, sustainable living, and educational reform. We can hear echoes of Moore's Island, the very idea of imagining a better world, not just as critique but as creation, is perhaps one of humanity's most enduring traits. We imagine utopias not because we believe we can make them real, but because the imagining itself moves us. It clarifies what we value. It shines a gentle light on our compromises. It gives us language for our longings. And so Moe's little book, penned over 500 years ago, continues to ask its quiet questions. What kind of world do we want to live in? What are we willing to change to reach it? And how might we live together if we let go of what we think must always be as night settles and the noise of the day fades? There is something soothing in remembering that someone once dared to map a place that never was, and in doing so gave us permission to dream of places that still could be. Chapter 8. The Curious Case of Tarrare. The man who could eat anything in the tangled streets of late 18th century France, at a time when the world teetered between Enlightenment reason and the strange persistence of mystery, there lived a man who defied explanation. His name was Terror, and if the stories are true, or even half true, he may have been one of the most unusual individuals in recorded medical history, born into a world that was only beginning to explore the boundaries of the human body. Tarrare became a figure of fascination, horror, and quiet sorrow. He was, as the old accounts say, the man who could eat anything. Tarrare was born around 1772, likely in or near Lyon. His full name is unknown. His surname, perhaps, lost to poverty and time from an early age. It was clear that he was not like other children. He ate constantly, devouring his family's food, scavenging for scraps, and still never seeming satisfied. By the time he was in his early teens, his appetite had grown so immense that his family, unable to support his consumption, cast him out alone and perpetually hungry. He wandered through the countryside. He made his way as a street performer, entertaining crowds by swallowing stones, corks, live animals, even whole baskets of apples, one after the other. His body, lean but distended, carried signs of his condition. He was of average height, but his mouth gaped unnaturally wide. His teeth were small, yellowed, and spaced far apart. His skin hung loose in folds. When full, he would bloat like a drum. When empty, he seemed to collapse in on himself, and always there was the smell, a thick, sour odor that clung to him, worsened by sweat and a chronic lack of hygiene. At the height of the French Revolution, Terror found his way into the army. It was not a matter of patriotism, perhaps, but of necessity. Soldiers were given, and rations, yet even military portions, could not satisfy him. He would eat his share, and then beg trade, or steal from his fellow soldiers. When that failed, he scavenged from waste piles, drank water from ditches, and once, according to reports, was caught following a surgeon around in hopes of gaining access to the bodies of the dead. His appetite attracted attention not just from fellow soldiers, but from military physicians. He was sent to the hospital at Salz, where doctors began to observe him with a mix of disbelief and fascination. Among them was Dr. Pierre-Francois Perry, who left behind some of the most detailed records of Terre's condition. Percy described how Tarrare could eat enormous quantities in one-sitting meals that would leave most men ill without apparent consequence. His behavior in the hospital was disturbing. He would eat the food intended for other patients, search through gutters, and refuse for bones, and once attempted to drink the blood of the surgeons during a procedure. Still, the doctors were intrigued. They began testing the limits of what Tarrare could swallow. He devoured live eels, crunching them whole. He consumed raw AUL, including lungs and livers taken from animals. The records mention that he once ate a live cat, tearing it apart and swallowing it piece by piece for, and all it is, here in the dim halls of the hospital, that his story takes an even stranger turn. The French military, desperate for advantage in a time of war, wondered if Tarrare could serve a new purpose. If he could eat anything, could he perhaps be used as a courier, swallow a document, cross enemy lines, and recover the message once through? It was a strange idea, but strange times bred strange solutions. Tarrare was given a trial mission. He swallowed a wooden box containing a note, crossed the frontier into Prussian territory, and was promptly captured under interrogation. He confessed everything. The Prussians, skeptical and appalled, beat him, held him for a time, and then miraculously let him go. He returned to France, humiliated, and the military dismissed him. From there, his health declined. The doctors at Sousse tried to find explanations. They speculated about a malformed digestive tray, a neurological disorder, perhaps a parasite robbing him of nutrition. Some guessed that his brain was affected, that the hunger stemmed from something beyond the physical. Tarrare himself seemed to know no peace. He was tormented, not just by appetite, but by his own alienation. People recoiled from him. He stank. He could not stop eating. But no amount of food brought satisfaction. It was not gluttony. It was need toward the end of his life. He begged the doctors to cure him. Dr. Percy attempted various treatments, vinegar-based tonics, tobacco pills, but nothing worked. Tarrare would comply for a time, but always returned to his compulsions. At last, in 1798, he fell ill with tuberculosis, his body, long taxed, beyond its limits, began to fail. He died in a hospital in Versailles at the age of 26. An autopsy was performed. Percy described the results in detail: an esophagus that gaped unnaturally, wide a stomach that filled nearly his entire abdomen, and organs that were in many cases stretched or enlarged. But even in death, there were no clear answers. No single cause could explain the breadth of his condition. He was, to the last, a mystery in the years since Tarrare has been discussed in medical journals and folklore alike. Some believe he suffered from polyphia, a condition marked by insatiable hunger. Others suggest a rare metabolic disorder, perhaps hypothyroidism, or even damage to the hypothalamus, the part of the brain that regulates appetite. There are more speculative ideas too: genetic mutations, neurological trauma, chronic parasitic infection. And then there are those who wonder how much of the story is true. The details, after all, come from a few main sources. Some of the more grotesque claims that he ate human remains that he once attempted to devour a toddler rest on anecdote rather than documented evidence. It is likely that the real Tarrare was both less monstrous and more pitiable than legend makes him. But the core of the story remains a young man afflicted by an unbearable hunger, studied and prodded, used and dismissed, and ultimately left behind. He became a medical curiosity, a sideshow of the Enlightenment era, when the boundaries of science were expanding, but still clouded by uncertainty. There is something quietly tragic in his tale. Tarrare was not a man who wanted to astonish or revolt. He did not choose to become a symbol of bodily excess. He lived in a time that could barely feed its own poor, and he required more than 10 men. His body was just a prison. His mind, by some accounts, was lucid and sad, and so we remember him not as a monster, but as a question. What makes us who we are? How does the body shape the soul? What do we do when faced with someone whose needs fall outside all comprehension? Tarrare's case lives on, not because it is shocking, but because it is unresolved. Because even now, with all we know of medicine and biology, we do not fully understand what happened to him. We can guess, we can theorize, but somewhere between the accounts of his endless appetite and the emptiness that followed, there lies a silence that asks us to look more closely, not just at the extremes of human physiology, but at the quiet suffering behind them. In that sense, Tarrare was not just an anomaly of the past, but a reminder of how much mystery still lives in the human form, and perhaps how much care we owe to those mysteries when they cross our path. Chapter N9, The First Robot. Rebellion. 1582. In the year 1582, Spain sat at the golden edge of empire, its galleons heavy with silver sill from the New World, its court robed in the confidence of conquest, and its soul bound tightly in the grip of the Catholic Church. It was a world of wealth and grandeur, but also of shadows and silence, a time when innovation moved hand in and with suspicion, and even the most brilliant creation could be mistaken for heresy. In the hills outside Toledo, where the wind carries the scent of cypress, and the sky often feels too wide for the narrow streets below, there stood a quiet monastery, cloistered, stone-hewn, tucked among olive groves. It was a place of routine and reverence, the kind of place where footsteps echoed for lack of conversation, but within its cool walls, a strange kind of miracle was unfolding, not one born of prayer, but of gears pulling and hidden springs. The monks who lived there were not all alike. Some were scribes bent over vellum and ink, others tended gardens or sang the liturgy in soft measured tones. But one among them, or perhaps a few, possessed a gift for craft that went beyond the ordinary. Their hands, practiced in devotion, also moved with the precision of engineers, inspired perhaps by the ancient texts of Hero of Alexandria, or by the mechanical marvels that had begun to filter through Europe from the East. They began to build what emerged was unlike anything the cloister had seen. At first, the automata was simple wooden figures that nodded or turned or rang bells when a string was pulled, but slowly they grew more sophisticated by the dim light of candles and the rhythm of Gregorian chant. The monks constructed lifelike figures, humanoid machines, clothed in monastic robes, faces carved with serene expressions, their arms jointed and capable of movement. Some walked short distances, others raised their hands in benediction. One, it was said, could beat its chest in the rhythm of penance, as though murmuring, Mea culpa mea, maxima culpa. The most intricate among them resembled a monkin prayer when wound by a key, concealed in its robes. It would kneel, cross itself, lift its gaze upward, and move its lips in silent devotion. The mechanism inside was no larger than a bread loaf, but it had been shaped with such care that each movement seemed imbued with intent. To see it in motion was to feel something like a strange flicker at the edge of the sacred, and the uncanny word spread slowly, as it always does, when wrapped in secrecy. A visiting bishop glimpsed the machines and made polite inquiries. A noble patron of the monastery mentioned the marvels in a letter eventually. Whispers reached the ears of the Inquisition, and when they did, the reaction was not curiosity but fear. The Holy Office of the Inquisition, headquartered in Seville, had been established to safeguard the soul of Spain. Heresy in any form was hunted with fervor. Alchemy, astrology, unorthodox philosophy, these were watched carefully. And the idea that men had built lifelike figures who performed the rites of the church without soul or spirit, that was no mere novelty. It was a provocation. An investigation was launched. Records of it, like many things touched by the Inquisition, are incomplete, but fragments remain references to unnatural imitation, to the confusion of artifice with holiness, to the peril of playing at God's handiwork. Some in the church feared sorcery. Others, perhaps more quietly, feared what it meant if such machines could be made at all. The monks who had built them did not claim to be divine. They insisted their creations were tools for teaching, for contemplation. One wrote that the automata allowed novices to meditate more deeply on the meaning of prayer, but the subtleties of purpose were not enough to still the right ring. Unease, some of the automata were seized. A few may have been dismantled. Others perhaps were hidden, disassembled, scattered or buried in the dusty corners of old workshops. And some accounts suggest that one or two remained protected in private chapels or locked cabinets, kept like sacred. In a way, the automata had committed no rebellion. They had not risen. They had not spoken. They had not defied their makers, but their very existence challenged the order of things. Machines were not supposed to mimic men, let alone monks to walk. Was one thing, to pray was another. The boundary between divine creation and human imitation had been blurred, and that was enough to stir the old fear that man, in reaching too far, might invite ruin. Looking back, the automata of 1582 were part of a broader fascination that threaded through Renaissance Europe. In Italy, clockmakers built intricate mechanical birds and dancing figures. In Prague, the legend of the golem spoke of life conjured from clay and words in Muslim Spain. Centuries earlier, scholars like Al-Jazari had designed complex water clocks and mechanical animals. The line between science and sorcery was never fixed. But these automata stood apart, not just for their craftsmanship, but for their setting to build lifelike machines within the hallowed halls of a monastery was to stir the dust of ancient questions. What is? The soul can motion mimic spirit. If a figure kneels and crosses itself, does it mean anything? If no heart beats within the church had long taught that man alone was made in God's image, endowed with breath and will, a machine that imitated piety threatens not just theology, but identity. And yet, there is tenderness in the idea that these machines were born of faith, not in spite of it. Perhaps the monks who met them did not seek to rival God, but to understand his craft. Perhaps they believed that by building a machine that prayed, they were honoring the mystery of prayer itself, creating a reflection, however dim, of divine order through gears and wood. What became of the monks and of the automata remains uncertain. No names have passed clearly into record. The monastery, unnamed in surviving documents, may have been absorbed, repurposed, or left to decay. But the echoes of their work linger in later centuries. Automata would return in drawing rooms, in museums, in the pages of science fiction. In the 18th century, a Spanish engineer named Juanelo Turano built a mechanical monk so lifelike that it knelt and prayed its rosary, thinking softly. With each movement, some believe it was inspired by the creations of 1582. That monk still exists, preserved in a museum, a quiet survivor of a world that once shivered at its kind. The story of the first robot rebellion is not one of violence, but of discomfort. The rebellion was not in the machines, but in the minds of those who saw them and asked, what if man can make something that acts alive? What if imitation crosses into creation? What if we in our tinkering touch something sacred? And so nestled between faith and fear, the automata of 1582 slipped into the folds of forgotten history, not because they failed, but because they succeeded too well. They are asked questions that Europe was not ready to answer. They moved when only God was meant to animate. And in doing so, they reminded us that the line between miracle and mechanism is sometimes thinner than we care to admit as we drift through the darkened corridors of time, past workshops and cloisters, past pulley and parchment. We might pause to imagine the flicker of candlelight on a wooden face, the soft creak of a joint, the lift of a hand toward heaven, a prayer without breath, a movement without life, and in that stillness, the first quiet echo of the future. Chapter 10. The Sinking of the Vasa. Sweden's $200 million shipwreck in the summer of 1628. The waters around Stockholm's harbor shimmered beneath a pale northern sun. It was a Sunday afternoon, and the city had gathered to watch a marvel take to the sea children perched on father's shoulders. Merchants paused mid-transaction, and courtiers in fine dress clustered along the docks. The object of their attention was immense and ornate, towering over the harbor like a floating cathedral. This was the Vasa, the pride of the Swedish Navy, and she was about to set sail for the first time. Sweden in those years was not yet the Sweden we know. Today it was an emerging power, ambitious and hungry. Under the rule of King Gustavus Adolphus, the country had grown militarily bold. It had reached deep into Northern Europe's conflicts, carving out influence in the 30 Years' War. The king was young, brilliant, and often at the front lines of his battles. But he was also a man of vision, and that vision demanded more than victories on land. It demanded a navy, a powerful symbolic force that could carry Swedish might across the Baltic and beyond. The Vasa was to be that symbol, commissioned in 1625. The ship was meant to be one of the most formidable warships of its age. She would carry 64 bronze cannons across 2 gun decks, more than many ships twice her size. Her hull would be richly decorated, her stern covered in carvings of lions, angels, Roman emperors, and Swedish royalty. These weren't just ornaments, they were statements. They told the world that would lead Sweden. Construction began in Stockholm under master shipwright Henrik Hybertsson, a Dutchman with deep experience but failing health. He died before the ship was completed, leaving his team to finish the work. But from the start, something was wrong. The Vasa was tall, too tall. Her hull was narrow, her upper decks stacked with heavy guns and elaborate carvings. Ballast stones and weight meant to stabilize her was added below, but not enough. Her center of gravity was high. She was, in simple terms, top-heavy, but the math of ship design was not yet formalized. Calculations were based on intuition, on precedent, on F, and over all of it loomed the King Gusta. Adolphus was not in Stockholm during the ship's construction. He was away at war. But his expectations were clearly known: more guns, more grandeur, more power. Those working on the VAA had little room to object. The political climate of Sweden was one of centralized authority, and no one wanted to be the bearer of bad news. In fact, tests were done. A simple demonstration had been carried out. 30 men ran back and forth across the deck to test the ship's stability. She rocked alarmingly. But the test was stopped midway, not because the problem was solved, but because the results were too troubling. Reporting them would have meant questioning the king's vision, and no one was ready to do that. So the Vasa was completed. Her sails were hoisted, her flags unfurled, and on August 10th, 1628, she was launched into the water for her maiden voyage. She left her mooring, slowly moving under light wind, watched by thousands. For the first few minutes, all seemed well. She drifted past the heart of Stockholm, her decorated stern gleaming, her gun ports open for the crowd to admire. Then a gust of wind caught her sails. The Vasa leaned, she righted herself, briefly. Then another gust came. The ship tilted hard to port water, rushed through the open gun ports, and just like that, the pride of Sweden began to sink. It happened in full view of the city. Onlookers screamed. Sailors leapt into the water within minutes. The Vasa had slipped beneath the surface, settling into the mud just over 100 meters from the shore. 30 to 50 people died, though the exact number was never known. The ship, a vessel meant to carry Sweden into a new age of power, had not sailed even 1 nautical mile. The court was stunned. An investigation was launched almost immediately. Witnesses were questioned. Shipbuilders, officers, dock workers, each gave their account. But the central question remained. Who was to blame? The answer, in the end, was no one. No criminal negligence was found. No one was punished. The shipbuilders had followed the king's specifications. The king, far away at war, had not given explicit orders that could be blamed. The inquiries circled around the truth, but never quite landed on it. The cause was obvious. The ship was unstable, but the reason no one had stopped its construction was more difficult to name. It was fear, in part. Fear of contradiction, fear of challenging royal authority. And it was ego, not personal, but national. The desire to build something magnificent had outpaced the willingness to listen to warning. In that sense, the Vasa did not sink because of a storm or an attack or bad luck. It sank because no one wanted to say no in the aftermath. The wreck was left where it had fallen. Salvages retrieved some of the valuable bronze cannons over the years, but the ship itself was gradually forgotten. The harbor changed, the city grew. The Vasa slept beneath layers of silt and time. It wasn't until the 20th century that her story would re-emerge. In the 1950s, an amateur archaeologist named Anders Fransen became fascinated with the ship. He believed it might still exist, preserved by the cold, brackish waters of Stockholm Harbor. He searched for years, dropping weighted probes, mapping the seabed, following fragments of rumor and record. In 1956, he found her. What followed was one of the most remarkable maritime recoveries in modern history. A full-scale salvage operation was launched. Divers worked in dangerous, murky conditions, digging tunnels beneath the hull to thread cables through. In 1961, after 333 years beneath the sea, the Vasa rose again. She emerged astonishingly intact. The cold, low-oxygen water had preserved the wood. Her hull, masts, and carvings were still there, silent but vivid. The ship was taken to a temporary dry dock, and then, eventually, to a custom-built museum. Today, the Vasa Museum in Stockholm is one of Sweden's most visited sites, a cathedral of wood and Tarrare that tells a story both grand and deeply human. Visitors who see her up close are struck first by the scale. She is massive both in size and ambition. Her carvings still bear the marks of chisel and paint. Her timbers whisper of craftsmanship and caution. Unheeded and around her, the museum tells the story, not just of a shipwreck, but of a moment in history when engineering bowed to pride and silence became the most dangerous force of all. The Vasa's legacy is not just as a failure, it is a story but as a leadership, communication, and the cost of not listening. It reminds us that even the most glorious vision must be weighed against reality, that questions, however uncomfortable, must be asked, and that true strength lies not in grandeur alone, but in the courage to speak when silence feels safer. Today, the Vasa rests in quiet light. Tourists shuffle softly around her children, stare in wonder. Historians still study her planks, her paints, her ballast stones. And as they do, the ship tells her story again, without bitterness, without blame, just a steady whisper from beneath the wave, reminding us of what was built, what was lost, and what remains. And in that whisper, we hear something enduring, a ship that never sailed but still travels through time. Chapter 11, the Great Emu War of 1932. In the wide sunburned spaces of Western Australia, where wheat fields stretch into the horizon and the wind carries dust more often than rain, a strange conflict unfolded in the last months of 1932. It wasn't a war in the traditional sense. No enemy soldiers, no grand declarations, no parades of triumph or mourning, but it had troops, it had weapons, and it had a remarkably stubborn opponent. It would go down in history as the Great Emu War, a curious and somewhat comical episode where a man armed with machine guns found himself humbled by a bird. To understand how such a moment came to pass, we must look first at the land itself and the people trying to tame it after World War I. The Australian government, like many around the world, faced the difficult task of reintegrating returning soldiers into civilian life in an effort both to reward and employ veterans. The government offered parcels of farmland across the country, especially in Western Australia. Men who had fought in the mud of Dieppe and the trenches of France now found themselves on scrubby plots, tilling soil and planting wheat in a region not always kind to agriculture. By the early 1930s, their struggle had worsened. The Great Depression had reached Australia with full force. Wheat prices plummeted, machinery broke down, rainfall was scarce, and pests were plentiful. And then, in late 1932, the emu arrived. Emus are not small creatures towering over most people's waistlines with powerful legs and thick feathers. They move in packs and cover ground quickly. They are flightless, yes, but swift, capable of running over 30 miles per hour, and surprisingly nimble that year. Tens of thousands of emu migrated inland from coastal regions, as they often did in search of food and water. But this time, their path led them straight into the freshly planted wheat fields of Western Australia. For the struggling farmers was a disaster. The emu trampled fences, tore through crops, and disrupted the already precarious farming operations. They would descend in flocks, stripping the fields clean with their beaks and leaving chaos in their wake. The farmers tried scaring them off. They tried shooting at them, but the birds came in waves, seemingly endless, desperate. The farmer turned to the government, and the government, faced with a peculiar but pressing problem, made a peculiar decision. They sent the army more precisely. They dispatched a small unit led by Major G.P.W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery. Meredith brought with him 2 soldiers, 2 Lewis machine guns, and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The goal was straightforward: cull the emu population, protect the wheat fields, and restore some order to the countryside. What followed, however, was anything but straightforward. The campaign began in November. The soldiers expected to find large flocks grouped together, easy targets. But Emu, it turned out, had no intention of cooperating. They scattered quickly at the sound of engines and gunfire. They ran in tight clusters, bobbing and weaving unpredictably, vanishing into the bush with remarkable agility. Attempts to H them into gun range failed. One early engagement involved sneaking up on a group at a dam only for the birds to scatter before a shot could be fired. When the gunners finally opened up, the birds were already moving, and most escaped unscathed. On another occasion, the soldiers mounted one of the guns on a truck and gave chase. But the terrain was rough. The truck bounced wildly, and the gunner couldn't get a clear shot. The emus, seemingly unfazed, outran the vehicle. The episode resembled a cartoon more than a military operation. Over the course of several weeks, the soldiers fired thousands of rounds. Estimates vary, but only a few hundred birds were killed. The emus, for their part, seemed almost to adapt. They moved in smaller groups. They changed patterns. The farmers joked that they had appointed their own generals. Major Meredith himself would later remark with a touch of admiration that the emus had shown a degree of military organization and resilience that any army would envy back in Canra. Word of the campaign reached the press, and once it did, the story took on a life of its own. Headlines: guns versus birds, the mighty Australian army styed by a flightless foe. International papers picked it up, some treating it with dry amusement, others with gentle ridicule. It was in every way a public, real nation's embarrassment. By early December, the campaign was halted. The military withdrew. The emus remained. The government quietly shifted tactics. Fencing, subsidies were increased. Bounties were offered to hunters. Local efforts proved more effective than federal firepower. In time, the emu population was brought under control through more traditional means. But the story of the war had already taken root. No medals were issued. No territory changed hands. But the Great Emu War left behind a legacy of questions about bureaucracy, about the gap between intention and execution, and about the unpredictable force of nature when faced with rigid planning. At its heart, the episode is not just a comedy of errors, though it has all the elements. It's also a reminder of the challenges of governing a vast wild land where policy must bend to landscape and assumptions can quickly unravel. It reflects the pride of a young nation still learning to balance ambition with humility for the soldiers involved. It must have been an odd chapter in their careers for the farmers, a source of both frustration and laughter. And for the AMU, well, they carried on as they always had, indifferent to the strange affairs of men. Today, the story lives on in articles, documentaries, and the occasional tongue-in-cheek commemoration. It has become part of Australia's folklore, often retold with a twinkle in the eye and a shake of the head. It endures not just because it was strange, but because it was human, a moment when plans met reality and the birds won in a world full of wars with terrible cost. The Great Emu War stands apart, bloodless, for the most part, embarrassing, but benign, a footnote in history perhaps, but a footnote worth remembering because sometimes the stories we tell at the end of the day are not about triumphs or tragedies, but about the sheer unpredictability of life, about the way the world occasionally resists being ordered, and about how, in the dusty heat of Western Australia, a few men with machine guns met their match in a flock of birds with nowhere else to go. It is, in its way, a quiet parable about persistence, about folly, and about the curious dignity of the emu striding across the plains unbothered, unbroken, and entirely victorious. Chapter 12, The Corpse That Fooled Hitler. Operation Mincemeat in the spring of 1943. As the Second World War pressed into its fourth year, the outcome was still uncertain. The Allies had turned the tide in North Africa, pushing Axis forces into retreat. But the greater challenge lay ahead: the invasion of Southern Europe. The question was, where for the Germans? Sicily was the obvious choice. It was the closest European point, from North Africa, the natural stepping stone from Tunisia to the Italian mainland. And because it was obvious, it was heavily defended. His hit had long viewed the Mediterranean as a vulnerable flank, and German divisions stood ready to repel any attempted landing. The Allies knew that an invasion of Sicily would be bloody and costly, unless they could convince the Nazis to look elsewhere. And so, in an office deep within British intelligence, an idea took root. An idea as strange as it was brilliant: to use a dead body to tell a lie so convincing that it would alter the course of the war. The plan came to be known as Operation Mincemeat. It began with a group of intelligence officers within the 20 Committee, Britain's Deceptions branch. Two men were at its center: Jan Montig, a barrister turned naval intelligence officer, and Charles Chandley, a flight lieutenant, known for his flair for the unconventional. The idea had been circulating in the corridors of espionage for some time, and even Ian Fleming, not yet the creator of James Bond, but already a naval intelligence aide, had suggested a version of it. What if, they wondered, the Germans could be made to believe that the Allied invasion would strike not at Sicily, but at Greece and Sardinia? And what if that false belief could be planted not through intercepted communications or double agents, but through something far stranger: a body washed ashore with secret documents suggesting a completely different plan? The premise was absurd, and that was part of its genius. It was so elaborate, so theatrical, that no one would assume it had been staged. But to pull it off would require precision, patience, and the careful crafting of a fiction so airtight that even the Gesto would believe it. First, they needed a body. In January 1943, a homeless man named Glinder Michael died in London after ingesting rat poison. He had no family, no history that would raise questions. In death, he became the unlikely cornerstone of one of the most successful deception operations in military history. His body was preserved, carefully stored in dry ice to prevent decomposition, while Montague and Shell building his new life. He would be called Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. He would be given a fiancée named Pam, letters from his father, a photograph, a set of keys, a receipt for a new shirt and ticket stubs. From a recent movie, his uniform was tailored. His pockets were filled with the ordinary detritus of a British officer's life, all of it designed to pass any scrutiny that might follow. But the most important item was a black briefcase, chained to his wrist. Inside it, carefully folded, were false documents: a letter from Lieutenant General Sir Arkell N.Y., the Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, addressed to General Alexander in Tunisia, described plans for an invasion of Greece, and hinted at a secondary target in Sardinia, Sicily, was barely mentioned. To German eyes, it would be intelligence gold. The delivery of the body had to be perfect. The chosen location was the southern coast of Spain, near the city of Gela. Though Spain was officially neutral, its authorities leaned toward the Axis, and the region was crawling with German agents. A British submarine, HMS Serif, carried the corpse across the sea and surfaced quietly In the early hours of April 30th, 1943, with solemn ceremony, the crew released the body into the waves, letting the tide carry it ashore. The officer who led the mission later described it as one of the strangest duties he had ever performed. Not a burial, not quite a launch, but something in between. A fisherman discovered the body not long after Spanish officials recovered it, along with the briefcase, and the British Embassy responded as planned, requesting the return of their officers' remains and stressing the sensitive nature of the documents. The hope was that the documents would be copied before they were handed back, and indeed, they were through diplomatic channels. Word reached Berlin. The documents were passed to German intelligence and then forwarded to the highest levels. Adolf Hitler himself read them to British observers. The signs were subtle but unmistakable. German troop movements shifted. Reinforcements were sent to Greece. The defenses on Sicily were thinned. And so, on July 9th, when the Allies launched Operation Husky and landed in Sicily, they met less resistance than expected. The campaign was still hard-fought, but it succeeded within 6 weeks. Sicily was under Allied control. The deception had worked. Operation Mincemeat had done more than moved soldiers on a map. It had moved Mindes. The body was eventually buried in Welver under the name Major William Martin. For decades, his true identity remained unknown. Only much later was Glender Michael acknowledged as the man behind the mask. His grave remains tended by the Commonwealth War. Graves Commission, a small, quiet tribute to a man who never knew his role in history. In the years since the story of Operation Mincemeat has been told in books and films, sometimes with a wink, sometimes with awe. It is tempting to see it as a footnote, a curious tale from the margins of the wall. But it was in truth a turning point. It revealed the power of deception, not as a crude tool, but as a precise art. It showed how a well-told story, even when entirely false, can shape the decisions of powerful men. It also raised uncomfortable questions. The ethics of using a real human body for strategic ends were debated. Even at the time, the operation required not just ingenuity, but a certain coldness, a willingness to treat death as a means to an end. Yet, in the calculus of total war, such choices were made daily in quieter ways. Perhaps what makes Operation Mincemeat so enduring is not only its success, but its strangeness. The mix of espionage and narrative of war and fiction. It was a spy story, written in ink and seawater, performed on a stage that stretched from London to Berlin, with a cast that never quite knew they were playing roles. And through it all, at the center, lay a single figure, a man who, in death, became something else entirely, a character, a message, a deception so convincing that it changed the course of a continent today. In quiet corners of intelligence services around the world. Operation Mincemeat is still studied, not just for what it achieved, but for what it revealed, that in times of crisis, the most powerful weapon is sometimes not a bomb or a gun, but a story carefully crafted, believably told, and released like a ghost into the currents of history. And so, in that strange spring of 1943, while the world fought on land, in air and at sea, a quiet current moved through the waves off the coast of Spain. A body floated ashore. A briefcase was opened, and the fate of a war shifted ever so slightly toward a different shore. Chapter 13, The Exploding Pants Epidemic in 1930s. New Zealand in the quiet pastures of 1930s. New Zealand, a place known more for sheep and solitude than scientific mishap. A peculiar phenomenon began to unsettle the rhythm of rural life. Farmers, hardened by sun and soil, were accustomed to the usual challenges. Stubborn crops, stubborn weather, but nothing in their experience had prepared them for trousers that burst into flame. The 1930s were not easy years. The global economic depression had reached the far corners of the British Empire, and New Zealand, largely dependent on agriculture and export markets, felt its effect sharply. Farmers were under pressure to produce, to maintain pastures, and to keep their land free of invasive pests. Among the worst of these pests was a plant with cheerful yellow flowers and a tenacious root, ragwar. Ragwar had long plagued pastures, competing with grass and threatening livestock. It was particularly toxic to cattle and horses, and its spread had become a national concern. The New Zealand government, seeking to assist struggling farmers, introduced new strategies for controlling the weed. One such strategy was chemical, and the chemical in question was sodium chlorate at the time. Sodium chlorate was hailed as a powerful herbicide, a white, crystalline powder that could be dissolved in water and sprayed onto regret-withered thistles or other invasive flora. It worked. The plants died, but as it turned out, sodium chlorate did not quietly return to the soil or vanish into the wind. It lingered, and it had a dangerous tendency to cling. Farmers mixed the solution in barrels and applied it by hand over time. The chemicals soaked into their clothing, trousers, shirts, and especially the hems and cuffs, where splashes were frequent, absorbed the sodium chlorate solution. With each use, the fabric became more infused. It dried, stiff-coated, in the invisible residue of a compound with explosive potential. What many didn't realize was that sodium chloride, once dried into fabric, became highly combustible. It had a chemical structure that encouraged rapid oxidation. In simple terms, it turned ordinary cotton or wool into something alarmingly close to tinder. All it took was friction, a spark, or in some cases, the mild heat of a fire or stove, and the trousers would ignite. The first reports came almost hesitantly. A farmer in Canterbury mentioned that his pants had begun to smolder after standing too close to a heat source. Another described a strange hiss and a puff of smoke while bending near a fireplace. Then came the more dramatic accounts, trousers bursting into flames. During chores, the startled yelp of a man, suddenly a flame from the knees down, neighbors rushing with blankets or buckets. It was both terrifying and undeniably absurd. Soon the story spread in small-town pubs and local newsletters. The legend of the exploding pants began to take root. Some found humor in it, others were more cautious. But for the farmers themselves, the incidents were serious. Burns were not uncommon. Clothing was ruined. A simple task like lighting a pipe or standing near a wood stove became a gamble. The rural calm of the countryside now carried an unpredictable volatility. The government response was muted. Sodium chlorate remained widely available, and its risks, while acknowledged in technical circles, were not widely communicated to those using it. There was no widespread recall or public information campaign. In part, this reflected the ER's general approach to occupational safety. Risks were expected. Life was hard, and a certain stoicism ran through rural communities. But beneath that stoicism, frustration simmered. Some farmers began to adjust. They washed their clothes more frequently or kept separate garments for spraying. Others switched to different weed control methods. A few stopped using sodium chlorate altogether, yet the product remained on the market for years, and the incidents, though infrequent, never entirely vanished. Newspapers at the time mentioned these events in brief, often in the margins of rural pages. One report, now yellowed and archived, described a man whose trousers caught fire while he was tending a bonfire. The article, written with a touch of dry wit, noted that he escaped with minor injuries and a significant loss of dignity. Another piece described the phenomenon more, gravely warning farmers to take care when handling chemical treatments. But by and large, the story remained local anecdotal. Half believed it wasn't until much later, decades on, that historians and scientists returned to the tale with more curiosity. The phrase exploding trousers resurfaced in the early 2000s when researchers looked into the chemical properties of sodium chlorate and its interaction with organic material. A few academic papers published with a straight face and a twinkle in the eye confirmed the chemistry. Sodium chlorate treated fabrics could indeed combust with remarkable ease. The farmers of the 1930s. New Zealand had not been exaggerating. The story found new life in books, documentaries, and the occasional radio special. It became part of the quirky folklore of science, reminder that even the most practical solutions can carry strange consequences in classrooms. It offered a memorable example of chemical reactivity in rural museum. It sometimes appeared in exhibits on farming life. A pair of trousers blackened at the cuffs stood behind glass in one such display, their tag reading, "Recovered from the Great Ragwort Campaign, 1933. Yet beneath the humor and hindsight lies something more sober, a story about how well-meaning policies can go awry and how those on the ground, the farmers, the workers, the everyday people, bear the weight of misjudged decisions. Sodium chlorate was not given out maliciously. It was intended to help. But the gap between chemical knowledge and public understanding proved wide. Warnings were sparse, guidelines, if they existed, were vague. And in that gap fires sparked, there's something deeply human, woman, in the image of a farmer, trousers of flame, dashing across a field with a bucket of water. It's both comic and tragic, ridiculous and real. It reminds us that history is not always grand or solemn. Sometimes it is shaped in small explosions, in the smoldering hems of work clothes, in the quiet resolve of someone who simply changes into another pair of pants and goes back to work. The exploding pants epidemic of 1930s New Zealand may never have reached the scale of a national crisis, but in its strange combustion of chemistry, agriculture, and human experience, it tells a story worth remembering, a story of cause and effect, of action and unintended consequence, and of the curious ways that science, when brought into the everyday, can surprise is even the most seasoned among us. So, tonight, as the wind rustles through imagined wheat fields and the sky fades to quiet gray, picture the hills of rural New Zealand nearly a century ago. A man leans on a shovel, a dog chases birds along a fence line, and somewhere, not far off, someone's pants catch fire. And with that flicker, history finds one more way to astonish us. Thank you. Good night.